Okay, yes, so this short video is about daylight savings time and how to deal with it in Power Automate. We're not going to talk about the whys and wherefores of daylight savings time, other than to say that it is in use in a number of areas around the world, and that if you're writing Power Automate flows, more than likely at some point you're going to have to deal with these fluctuations to local time because of daylight savings time, and this video will help you with that. Okay, so the first thing to say is to avoid raw date and time outputs from Power Automate. They look a bit of a mess. You can see an example of one in blue on the screen there. This is actually the 28th of October 2019 at 10 minutes past 10 and 10 seconds. But it's not actually that bad, but for most people, they wouldn't really appreciate that as a date. They would like to see it in a much more user-friendly format. The other issue with this is if you'd entered a date into, say, a Microsoft form or SharePoint, and the date was inside daylight saving time, for instance, the 1st of April 2022 at 10 AM, then what Power Automate will do is automatically say, oh, it's daylight saving time, so you must mean 9 AM, and it will change the time back by an hour. But of course, if you've entered the date and time into one of those apps as the 1st of April, then you probably know it's daylight savings time, but you probably also know that it's a specific time that you want. You wanted it to be 10 AM. You don't want it to be 9 AM. So again, don't use raw date and time outputs from Power Automate, because those things will happen during daylight savings time and it just looks a mess. Second thing to say is to avoid using the format date time function, because this doesn't solve the problem effectively. It does exactly the same as what you just saw in terms of the raw output, because even though it puts it in a friendlier format so that it's easier for people to digest and read, it still has that same issue with the time changing during daylight saving time. So again, if I entered 5th of June 2020 at 10 past 10, Power Automate goes, oh, it's daylight savings time, I have to take an hour off. Well, we don't want it to do that. We don't want it to take an hour off, but even so, it will do it. Even worse, if the time was midnight, then it would roll it back an hour, which means it's rolled it back into a previous day. So the whole date, in this case, would change to the 4th of June. So it really is not going to help you if you are dealing with dates in daylight savings time. If you're in a country that uses daylight savings time, all year round, you'll have this problem. So you need to make sure that you don't use this as your approach. Okay, so the first tip is to use the convert time zone action in Power Automate. In this example, we're using an absence request app. I've requested an absence, and I actually typed into the app that I want to be off on the 10th of May 2022, and I want to be off from 8 AM. What's happened on the right-hand side is you can see the base time actually says 7 AM. And that's because, again, Power Automate is assuming, oh, well, this is in British summertime, we'll have to take an hour off. Well, I don't want it to do that because I've already inputted the time correctly. That's the time I want to be off. I want to be off from 8 AM. I don't want to be off from 7 AM. So I don't want it to take off the hour. So to do that, I can use this convert start date function. I can set the source time zone and the destination time zone to be the same. So in this case, it's the London time zone, which I am in. And you can see the output at the bottom is that it gives me the 8 AM. The 8 AM that I actually originally entered into the absence request app is now coming out as the output because I've used convert start date. Now, if the date was in, let's say, January, before the start of British summertime, this wouldn't be a problem at all because the base time at the top would say 8 and the output would also say 8. So this therefore would work all year round. It would convert to the correct time whether you are in British summertime or whether you are in standard time. Okay, so on the other hand, if you are using a loop, then we would suggest you use the convert from UTC function instead. And in this case, you can see that it is iterating through a list of items, which are event dates, and it's going to convert each one of them to GMT standard time. And I am just exporting the time out of this and not the date part of it. Now, if this was a date that was during standard time, then it would convert, as you can see, from 2:30 to 2:30. It would keep it the same, because the date that I entered into the app and the date that I want would be exactly the same. However, during daylight savings time, it would add an hour on to what would come out in format date time otherwise. So again, in the app I typed in 3:30, format date time thinks it's 2:30, but what this does is forces it to show what I originally typed in, which was 3:30. So it's giving me the correct date all year round. Okay, so the final tip here is to do with outputting to Excel. Now, sometimes those previous two tips may be enough. You may be able to get your date into Excel without any hassle. It may work first time, but in my experience, it often doesn't. And to get data into Excel, particularly data into Excel, you need to use a much more complex formulae in order to make sure that it goes across in the correct format. So you may or may not be aware of some of the functions that are in this formula, but we'll just try and talk them through. In a nutshell, as I've said there, the ticks function, which is the innermost function being used here, the ticks function calculates the number of 100 nanosecond intervals, that's what the ticks are known as, between two different dates. So the value that's in blue is what's known as the tick value for the 30th of December 1899, which is what Excel calculates all its dates from. Okay, so it uses that as point 0 in time, and anything after that is plus however many 100 nanosecond intervals there are since that date. So what this is doing is it's finding the same tick value for the date that's been entered. In this case, I've actually used the output from tip 1, the convert start date function. So it gets the ticks value for whatever date has been used there. The sub function is to do a subtraction. So it's basically comparing my start date with the 30th of December 1899. It's then going to convert that into a floating point number, so it's got allowed to have decimal places, and finally it's going to divide it by that green number at the end, and this essentially is how to convert those number of ticks into days, and that's how Excel actually uses dates. So it doesn't actually have that really long tick number. It has the number of days that have elapsed since the 30th of December 1899 in order to do date. And as long as the cell that you're putting this into in Excel, as long as that cell has the date time formatting applied to it, then once you do this, it will appear correctly inside Excel. The day and the month will be in the correct places. There won't be any confusion. The time will be correct, and so on. So we would suggest that you use this formula when you are outputting data from data from Power Automate into Excel. And there's a really good article that has been written by Manuel T. Gomez. He's got a great website with lots of Power Automate references, and he's got a whole article that is shown there, and that article gives you information about how to use this function that we've just gone through. Okay, so thanks very much for watching this quick video on how to deal with daylight savings time in Power Automate. We hope that that's helped and that you'll be able to create flows that work all year round and deal with any local fluctuation in time.